So, welcome to the lecture 9, that is a introduction to crop modeling and simulation. So, in the past up to lecture 1 to lecture 8, we have discussed about the cropping systems, crop production systems, the components of crop production system, crop classifications, different type of cropping system. Then we have discussed about the input management, the nutrient managements are the as a weather parameters as input for the crop production, growth laws and use of the other parameters for the crop biomass and yield predictions. So, those lectures have given you understanding about the crop ecosystem and the need of the input management to maximize production. So, from now onwards we will go to the central theme of this course, that is crop modeling and simulations. So, how the inputs are used for the models and how the outputs are analyzed based upon the input management. So, for this lecture is crop modeling and simulations. So, we have discussed briefly about what is. So, we will discuss about what is crop modeling and simulations. Then we will discuss about the different type of the models and what are the objectives of modeling and crop system models. So, going through this what is crop modeling and simulation, particularly crop models. Crop models are the mathematical representation of as a real system that simulates represent the growth, development and yield under specific soil ecosystems, environment and the management conditions. So, this is as you write crop models you can say is a representation of a real system, like we write the y is equal to a plus b x. So, y is the output, x is the input, a and b are the parameters. So, the y depends upon the output depends upon the input x. So, as you that is a model, right. So, in case of the crop models, so there are it's a very complex ecosystems. If you see or the need of crop modeling, I can say why the crop modeling started. Because modeling phenomena has started from different fields, like physical science, mathematical science, modeling has gone on. In agricultural systems, production system, then the realization came, can you go for the modeling scenarios? No, can you predict the crop yield without having experiment? Because the crop system I discussed earlier, the components of crop production system, there is a soil system, weather system, the crop variety itself, genotype characteristic, and you put the management starting from land preparation, tillage, depth of sowing, seeding technique, nutrient management, water management, pest controls, harvest. So, there are so many factors are involved and this makes the system very complex. And if you go on conducting suppose experiment to know the effect of a specific factors, of course, the experiment takes long time and you need repeated experiments for 2 years, 3 years to get a conclusive results, and it may be required you have to do experiment in multi-location trial. So, then the scientist and engineer they could realize as modeling scenario is applicable others field, can you introduce the modeling in agricultural systems. So, that we can predict the crop yield or the crop as over the output or the water balance output or nutrient balance output or the crop growth or biomass yield without having means the limited time is a very quick and the limited expense. So, if you go for because the complex system, how can make it a very simpler using the crop system simulation, because it has a several long term uses, the huge implications, huge applications of the crop modeling. So, that will be discussing, that is why the crop models means is a mathematical representations that simulate the crop growth, the yield and the other the outputs as you say based upon the several conditions like the environmental conditions, genetic potentials of these crops and the management conditions. So, they simulate how the plants do respond to the, just let me explain here the crop models, they do simulate how the plants do respond to the, as discussed earlier, you can use the weather parameters to simulate the production, respond to temperature, radiations, inputs like water and nutrients and other management practices. The crop models that has a are used for the understanding physiological process. So, the crop the crop output, the production that depends upon the photosynthesis, respirations, formation of several biochemical compounds in the plant. So, that for understanding of the as a physiological processes, then goes for the predicting the growth and the yield of the crops. Then through these predictions we can go for the evaluation of the management practices, because you can change the different management practices and see how the changes that bring the changes in the output. Then other also you can have a climate risk analysis, climate change impact assessment. So, you can create a scenario of climate change which may not be possible under the field conditions, that you can create in the as a modeling scenario, and you can understand the effect of climate change or change in carbon dioxide, change in temperature, change in radiation, change in rainfall parameters, those effect how they influence the crop output, crop biomass or the model outputs, that we can also understand. So, models differ, there are different models available for the crop system simulations. So, there are depends upon the structure, data requirement and the purposes. So, this the core concept of crop model, if you see, that is for the as we discussed earlier also, these 4 major components that we do the management, but particular crop, for a particular crop having crop variety, that is a genetic potential, genotype of the crops, in a particular weather, soil, like a weather parameter like radiation, temperature, rainfalls, and a particular soil system has a physical, chemical, biological properties. Then we do change the management practices like fertilizers, irrigation, planting dates. Then we do quantify the model output, to quantify these interactions, either genotype interactions or the environmental interactions with the managements. Then we quantify the growth, yield, and also we calculate the resource use efficiency. So, this is the modeling that makes things very simpler. You can you have a good model, then you can evaluate different management scenarios, and also that gives a better understanding of the system behavior, how the inputs management they do interact with each other to give the final output. So, so what I am discussing here, you can see the components of this crop models, as we discussed earlier also. There are 4 major components of crop production system. So, the weather is a component, one component, soil system is another component, crop genotypes is one component, and management 4th component. These are the 4 major components of crop production system we have discussed in detail at the earlier classes to give a better understanding about crop production systems. In reality, in the real field, as you say, in experiment, in field, these components are very essential must for the crop production, crop output. We have discussed about weather effect of weather parameters in details earlier classes. Soil systems, we have discussed the soil physical properties, soil chemical properties and biological properties that lead to water availability and the nutrient availability for the crops. So, that soil system influence the crop productions. Crop genotype is the genetic potential of a particular variety, because now if you take an example of a particular crop like rice crop, they have thousands of varieties and they have the different yielding potentials. So, our the productions as you see, when you are attaining to maximize productions, always are targeted to reach the attainable yield. We have discussed about the farmer's yield or the actual field yield, attainable yield and the potential yield. So, our target how we can reach attainable yield and minimize the yield gap, that is the difference between the attainable yield and the actual yield. So, for that there is a management practices that plays a big role, how we can modify our management, then we can reach this attainable yield or we can minimize the yield gap. So, these are the four major components for the crop production system. So, those components are used as a different files in case of the crop modeling simulations. So, let us see this figure, I will explain this figure. If you see this figure, this is a rice crop and here there are the four components are there for the crop production. So, the soil is one of the component, this is the rice is grown usually under the standing water because none other crops may not survive. So, rice crops it can work better, it can give good productions under saturations and also it can survive under the standing water. Most of lowland conditions farmers used to grow for rice because the only crop can survive with the flood water. So, you see the soil, this is the surface soil and this is the flood water above the surface soil and this is the rice crop, right. And so, if you see the four major components of crop production, the soil is one of the components, then we have the weather parameters, solar radiation, temperature, albedo, CO2, these are the weather parameters, other components, component 2 and component 3 is your the crop, the rice crop itself as a genotype, the genetic potential, the yielding potential of the crop, the genotype characteristic of the crop, this is the crop itself is one component and the fourth component is your the management practices, how do you manage the crop. So, I will give you one example here, particularly the nutrient management, how you can manage your nutrients so that you can maximize production. In real experiment, in the reality of the field experiment. So, since rice is grown under flooded condition, the farmers used to apply, suppose the crop is in the standing crop, nitrogen fertilizer used for the split applications, those that gives of course when you go for the crop modeling fertilizer management. So, particularly phosphorus fertilizer, potassic fertilizer we go for the application at the time of sowing or planting with the well incorporated in the soil, but the nitrogen fertilizer, so that we go for the split applications. To increase the yield of the crop or the growth of the crop, so there are the three major nutrients the farmers used to consider, nitrogen, phosphorus, potash and also calcium, magnesium, sulfur, in addition to other micronutrients are there, we have discussed very briefly in the earlier classes. But farmers when you apply the fertilizer to have a maximized production, they to take more focus on the nitrogen, phosphorus, potash. So, nitrogen being a loss subjected to various type of losses, we go for the split applications. We apply at the beginning of the sowing or the planting of the crop as a basal application and some amount is kept for the top dressing to avoid the losses, to have a better use efficiency. We go for the split application at different days after transplanting of this rice crop. So, when the crop has come up, if you go for the N fertilizer application, the question comes where to apply the fertilizer. So, there you can see here you will apply in the soil definitely. So, in soil since the standing water, so you can apply fertilizer in the surface soil, the flood water or the standing water few top few centimeter within 10 centimeter of the soil, this remains as a oxidized zone where oxygen remains present, and the deeper layer of the soil, bottom layer more than 10 centimeter, mostly this is a devoid of oxygen or less oxygen is present, that is a reduced layer. So, now where to apply fertilizer, either the flood or surface soil, that is flood water or the surface soil, oxidized layers or the reduced layer. The three layers are given, where you should apply fertilizer, the loss will be less and the efficiency of the application will be higher. If you apply flood water, the source of the N fertilizer, for example, urea, if you apply urea urea under hydrolysis is converted to ammonium, and since you are applying surface soil, that most of the fertilizer goes for the runoff loss, and maybe some portion may come to the bottom layers, then ammonium, that becomes the ammonium, because bottom layer the reduced layers, ammonium gets now converted to nitrate. Nitrate is a negative ion and soil colored is a negative ion, and mostly nitrate goes for the leaching loss. So, this will be hardly available for the crop uptake if you apply in the flood water. The second option goes for the application in oxidized zone. If you go for applying oxidized zone, this urea under hydrolysis converted to ammonium, and this ammonium with presence of oxygen is oxidized to nitrite and then to nitrate. The presence of some bacteria, because now bacteria, as discussed, the soil microbes has a big role for the nutrient availability, because the process of the urea converted to as a hydrolysis ammonium form, ammonium converted to nitrite, nitrate, and the crop receives the ammonium form and the nitrate form of the nutrient. And the moment is converted to nitrate form, because of the concentration gradient and the negative ions, the nitrate that leaches to the bottom layer, reduced layer. And here since there is no oxygen or very less oxygen, maybe there lack of oxygen, the nitrates gets denitrified. So, denitrification subject to denitrification loss. So, that is lost to atmosphere as a nitrous oxide. So, that causes as a greenhouse gas, and that causes the warming of the atmosphere and say climate change. That is what we are complaining many times. The complaint comes because rice agriculture contribute climate change, and particularly if you see that the methane emission is also one of the important factor for the climate rice because of the anaerobic conditions, the organic matter get decomposed and methane emission comes from the rice field. And the second is the nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide global warming potential is around 300 times of the carbon dioxide, and the methane has 20 times global warming potential as compared to carbon dioxide. If you see nitrous oxide, that is if you do not apply fertilizer in the proper zone, then if you apply in the oxidized zones or in the flood water anyway place, because there is a loss of nitrogen through denitrification loss of the nitrous oxide, and that increases the greenhouse gas concentration, and that adds to the global climate change, and the rising temperature causes global warming. So, the only layer, the reduced layer, if you apply your urea fertilizer in this layer, under hydrolysis urea is converted to ammonium, and since there is a lack of oxygen in this layer, the remains in the ammonium form, and ammonium form of nutrient is also taken up by the rice crop. So, rice takes nutrient ammonium form. So, efficiency loss is less in this layer, efficiency is higher. So, that indicates there is no emission of the greenhouse gases or the nitrous oxide, because ammonium does not get converted to nitrate because of lack of oxygen here. So, there is no global warming threat if you apply fertilizer in the deeper layer. So, that is why the farmers are advised, if you are going for top dressing fertilizer, apply the fertilizer below 10 centimeter from the surface soil, and with that the loss will be less and the efficiency of fertilizer use will be higher, the yield will be enhanced. And there is a specific fertilizer applicator which can apply fertilizer in the right zone. So, if you apply fertilizer here, the yield will be higher, that is what the from experimental understanding. In model also that mimics same thing. The model also there is information you are applying top dressing of fertilizer at what depth you are using, what depth you are applying. If you go for top dressing, particularly urea fertilizer at the lower depth reduced layers, then the efficiency of fertilizer use will be much higher, loss will be less, and yield will be definitely higher. This is what goes from the experiment, and that is in modeling scenario, that is also this same thing is taken care how model can behave, can respond to the different way technique of fertilizer applications in the different depth of the soil. This is what we have done for these 4 components are there. So, all the 4 components in a model. So, each component indicate a file data sets, whether input data sets, the 4 files, weather file, soil files and the crop genotype file and management file. Management file that includes everything from the land preparation to harvest, irrigation management, input nutrient management, plant protection measures, seeding technique, everything comes under management. So, these 4 files are there. The 4 files are the input for the crop model, then you can have these simulations as per the output as user interest, we can get this output. So, what is simulation? These are the what is simulation? Simulation means using a computer that solving a model to mimic the real system behavior. So, what we discussed earlier. So, you see the real system behavior, if you apply fertilizer at a specified zone in case of rice, particularly the reduced layer, the yield will increase, loss of fertilizer will be less, that means the efficiency of the fertilizer will be maximum with the application at the proper zone. So, that is what the real system, and the simulation that using a computer software that solve a model to mimic that the real system behavior. So, you are giving the inputs here, that is weather, soil and the management data, and the output you can get as per the user interest. It may be the yield, it may be biomass, it may be phenology, as we have discussed what is phenology, and with the water nutrient balance. So, this helps giving the inputs and getting the outputs, but inputs should be a quality if you have quality data sets, you have a model is well calibrated tested model, then your output is a reliable output. That is what say that helps for you can play with the model with the different input parameters and you get the set of the output parameters. So, that model helps to explore what if scenarios. So, once the model is ready, model is as you said, that is a representation of the real system, this is the only equation, and there you have the simulation, you make simulation, solve the models using some of the computer logic and the flow diagrams, programming, you do solve the models. So, solving the models, you give the inputs, then you have the flow logics and you have the programming, you get the output. So, there you can have different scenarios, you can see the change of input management, increase the input levels, decrease the input levels and have the different scenarios. So, that is what if the rainfall decreases at 25% as you go for climate change scenarios. So, in case there is a loss of rainfall, less rainfall. So, what will happen to the crop productions? So, that we can because the idea of the crop modeling. So, it gives a prior informations about your productions without going for experiment. If you know the futuristic weather, this is going to the next year or next season weather is like this. If that type of the forecasting is there, because now we have the weather forecasting, we can go for the as a seasonal forecasting, 1 month advance, 2 month advance, 3 month advance, the extended range forecast, 3 months forecast. So, using those weather data, the forecast weather data, if you run your already the tested models, well tested ready model ready for the simulations, you can run the models, you can understand the effect of this weather parameters on crops. Accordingly, you can change the input parameters, what will happen, how then your management practices to get an understanding. So, what should the farming practices to maximize production. So, that model gives the model you have you can test the different parameter different input managements, you can understand the effect of what happens for change of any input management, that information you can get from this model. So, if you see there are different type of crop models are there. So, you see there is a DSAT model, this is globally this is known to everybody because there are huge users of DSAT model, and Decision Support System for agro technology transfer, and we will be using this model for our lecture course here, and also we will be give the sites from where you can download the models. Maybe next class we will give the website because you will be using this model. So, keep the model ready with you, we will go for the hands on exercise. So, we will be using this DSAT model. So, you have to you get the login and password from the DSAT developer, particularly this developed by University of Florida and DSAT Foundations. So, everybody all the students who are attending this lecture. So, you have to use and you have to download, is a free software, you have download the model, and once you go on discussing about this input management, how to input data inputs, you can try yourself, and also we will make a group of the students from here. You can either you can come forward, you can make your group and you can go for the as a demo simulations based upon the information data available on your locality, and the crop you can choose from your locality, or you can choose we can have a common crop for everybody. Let us to have a general understanding how to run the model. So, that the group basis you can give presentations. You have to this is where you can run, you can understand the input data entry, and you need to run the models and show the outputs, how the output changes to the change in the input parameters. And this simulates the growth, yield, and the weather conditions. Similarly, you have the upstream agricultural production system simulators by developed in Australia. This is long term cropping system simulation models particularly, and the InfoCrop is also developed by the in ICR and the India by particular group scientists from IRI. They have developed this simulation for the Indian conditions for rice, wheat, and maize. And CropSys developed by the Washington State University. CropSys is a cropping system simulation model. Cropping system means as we discussed earlier, we have the single crop, you have the multiple crops. So, usually happens you do not grow a single crop in a year, we go for the multiple crops in a year, and based upon the resource availability, particularly irrigation water availability, we go many 2 or 3 crops in a year. So, a CropSys used for the simulate the cropping system simulations. Then we have the world the food the WFOST the FAOs, they have also Washington Netherlands, they have developed the WFOST models. Then aquacrop model also developed by FAO. So, these are the models available. So, mostly will be DSAT is a widely used, globally used by DSAT, very huge number of users, and very comprehensive and a mechanistic model. So, we will be doing all our exercise for this the DSAT model. So, particularly the models are applied very briefly. This is the yield gap analysis to know, I discussed earlier the difference between the attainable and the actual yield, water and nutrient input management, climate change studies, climate risk analysis, then make decision support system, and the policy applications, food security assessments, and the resource planning, land use decisions. So, that is what we are using the DSAT model applications for this. So, with this are the key takeaway from this class. You can see the crop modeling is a scientific approach to simulate crop growth and yield under varying conditions. So, because experiment it definitely takes a long, we will discuss what the advantage of modeling over experiment or the complementarity of modeling experiment, and this is required with crop modeling. This also this supports the experimental understanding. If you go for the crop modeling and experiment parallel, this will go on parallel. So, it connects the crop processes, it gives a better understanding about crop processes and the environment management through computation. It is a computational analysis and modeling, and that also clears many of the understanding about the crop processes there. And the models that help in prediction, planning, and policy decision for agriculture, particularly the weather based crop planning, that because a particular locations there is a variability in weather. So, if you run the model is a readily all reliable model, if you use reliable model and run the models, you can have a many decision making, how to take care of the weather variability, how to minimize the loss of productions because of the variability in weather. That model can be applied, model can give lot of answers, lot of examples. So, that is because the model gives a only a output, but decision has to be taken by you, you are the decision makers. So, this is just like a discussion support system, we can say that simulation makes it possible that test scenarios before the field level implement. That means, it is a tool, model is a supporting tools for you in a decision making. So, if you want to make a crop planning for a particular locations for the with the variable weather conditions, then you can use the model. It can give some understanding, it can give many informations, many data, many knowledge that will help you in decision making process. So, this is about the very small introduction about the crop model. So, with this I thank you all.